Welcome back to the deep dive. So you want to really understand research. You want to run a small project, write it up right, the whole thing. We've got a ton of guides that you sent over. Honestly, some of the stuff in here, even I was like, whoa, really?
Yeah, research can be full of surprises.
It can. But we're going to aim for that aha feeling for you today without completely overloading you. And to help us sort through it all, we have an expert with us, someone who can see those patterns, make those connections that the rest of us miss.
I'll do my best. I love seeing how all the pieces fit together.
So small-scale research, right? You might think, oh, that's easy. But one thing our sources all agree on, even a tiny project, needs a strong foundation. It makes me think of that time I tried to bake a cake, didn't read the recipe all the way through. Disaster.
Yeah, I've been there. What was the missing ingredient?
Patience, mostly. But in terms of research, what's that first ingredient in our recipe?
Planning, definitely. It's kind of amazing how many people just jump right into collecting data without, a right map. It's like setting off on a road trip, no destination in mind, no map. You'll end up somewhere, but...
Not where you wanted to be.
Exactly. Lost and probably frustrated.
Okay, so speaking of roadmaps, our sources lay out these 7 steps to build a research project. Let's walk through those. Starting with step 1, selecting your topic. Now, I always struggle with finding a topic that's interesting, but not so huge that it's overwhelming. What do you think?
It's tough, yeah. You want that spark, that curiosity, but it's also got to be manageable. You're not going to build a skyscraper with only a handful of bricks.
Right.
A small project's more like building a model house. You can still be creative, be ambitious, but you got to work within limits,
So how do you know if your topic is the right size? Are there any warning signs to look out for?
One red flag is if you're having a really hard time coming up with a clear research question. If the topic's too broad, your questions will be too general. Instead of what's the impact of social media, maybe you zero in on how does Instagram use affect body image in teenage girls?
Much more focused.
Right.
Yeah.
Narrows it down, makes it something you can actually research.
Just like that research question, it's almost like a compass, it guides the whole journey. And speaking of journey, step 2 is all about diving into the existing research, what they call the literature review. And sometimes that feels overwhelming, like drinking from a fire hose. What's your strategy for getting through that stage?
I kind of see it as a detective's investigation, You're gathering clues, building your case to show that your research is needed. So start by finding those key sources in your field, the big important works that everybody cites. Then you can branch out from there, following those citations, exploring those related areas.
So not just reading everything, but being more strategic.
Exactly. And as you read, you're looking for those patterns, the gaps, maybe some disagreements. That helps you see where your research can add something new.
Okay, so step 3 is where we start getting into formulating those research questions and objectives. Now, those sound similar, but I know they're different. I even get them confused sometimes. Can you explain it, really simply?
Okay, imagine you're building a house, right? Your research question, that's like the blueprint. It lays out the overall plan, the purpose of the whole project, the objectives. Those are like the individual steps. Laying the foundation, framing the walls, putting on the roof. They break that big question into smaller, doable chunks.
I like that. So question sets the direction. Objectives are the steps. Our sources talk about making sure your objectives are smart. How do you make sure they are?
Each one needs to be specific, what exactly are you trying to do? Measurable, so you know if you've succeeded. Achievable, it actually can be done in your project. Relevant, obviously, to that big research question. And time-bound, meaning you give yourself a deadline.
Oh, deadlines. Those are important. Makes me think of setting goals in general. If they're not specific and you can't measure them, it's tough to stay motivated. So, we've got our topic, we've done our reading, we've got our SMART objectives. Time to get to work, right? That's where step 4 comes in, designing your research methodology.
Yeah, this is where you pick the right tools for the job. Are you going to do surveys, interviews, experiments? Each method, it's got strengths and weaknesses, So you got to choose carefully based on your question and objectives.
Got it. So let's say we've chosen our method. What happens next?
Now it's time to actually collect that data. This is step 5, and it takes careful planning to do it right. You need to find your participants, collect the data systematically, and make sure your information is accurate and reliable. It's like building that strong foundation for your analysis later on.
And then once you've got all that data, this is the fun part, at least for me, data analysis. Step 6, where we sift through all the info and try to make sense of it all. How do you approach this stage?
This is where those research questions you worked so hard on, they come back in. You're looking for patterns, trends, relationships in that data to answer those questions. It's kind of like solving a puzzle, right? You got all the pieces, now you got to put them together to see the big picture.
I love puzzles.
Me too. And research is a bit like that sometimes.
Absolutely. Finally, step 7, reporting your findings. This is where you get to share what you've discovered with the world. I have to admit, sometimes the idea of writing a formal research report, it's a little intimidating. Any advice for making that less scary?
Think of it as a story you're telling, a way to share your insights, engage your readers, and every good story needs structure, and a good flow. That's where those APA guidelines come in. They give you that framework for clear, consistent communication.
Okay, so we've got a roadmap for our research project. Now it's time to tackle that research report, and specifically, using those APA 7th edition guidelines. I know some people hear APA and they just tune out. Was that you? Or is it not as scary as it seems?
I get it, yeah. At first, it can seem kind of like, a secret code, something only academics understand. But honestly, it's more about being clear and consistent than, memorizing a bunch of rules. Think of it as a shared language that helps researchers communicate better.
So less about memorizing, more about understanding those big ideas. That makes me feel better. Our sources break this research report down into 10 parts. Let's start with the title page, the first impression. Seems simple, but are there any, common mistakes people make?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The title, it's like that first handshake, sets the tone. So you want to avoid anything too long or full of jargon. Go for clear and concise. Instead of an investigation into the neurophysiological correlates of cognitive dissonance, maybe you say, how our brains deal with conflicting beliefs. You see the difference.
Huge difference. And that second one, it draws you in, even if you don't know anything about neuroscience. Okay, so we've got a catchy title. What's next?
The abstract. It's like the movie trailer for your research. A short summary that hits those key points, your elevator pitch.
Abstracts are tough for me. How do you squeeze a whole research project into, one paragraph?
Focus on the essentials.
Yep.
What's the problem you're looking at? How did you study it? What'd you find? What's the takeaway? Imagine you're explaining it to someone at a party.
We wouldn't bore them with all the details, right?
Exactly. Hit the highlights, keep it interesting.
That's a good way to think about it. All right, now we're at the introduction, where we set the stage, kind of like that opening scene in a movie. Hooks the audience, sets the mood. What are your top tips for a good introduction?
Well, you got to give context, right? Why is this topic important? What's the knowledge gap you're filling? Then you introduce your research question. Give a little outline of your approach, but don't get bogged down in too many details yet. Save that for later.
So, short, engaging, like a sneak peek that makes people want to keep reading.
Yeah.
Got it. Now, the literature review, we talked about that a bit earlier. Our sources, they say it's important all the way through the research, not just that one section. How do you weave all that literature in without, drowning the reader in citations?
It's like you're joining a conversation, You're not just summarizing what others have said. You're engaging with those ideas, comparing different viewpoints, building on what's already known. You use the literature to back up your arguments, maybe highlight where there's missing information, and to give context to your own findings.
So it's not just listing sources, it's making them part of your story. What about the methodology section? What are the must-haves there?
Transparency. That's key. You want to be so detailed that someone else could redo your study exactly. So you describe your participants, your research design, how you collected the data, any special tools or materials you used. That's where those detailed descriptions of your surveys, interviews, experiments, that all goes in.
Okay, now for the heart of the report, the results section, where we show all that data we worked so hard for. How do you make that interesting for people who aren't, data experts?
Visuals. Charts, graphs, tables, they're your friends. They make the data pretty and easy to understand. But remember, the data can't speak for itself. You got to explain it clearly and simply. Highlight the key trends, the patterns.
It's like we're translating the data, right? Turning it into a story anyone can follow. Okay, results are in, time to analyze. The discussion section. This is where we really dig into what the results mean. How do you handle this part?
This is where you connect the dots. You're linking your findings back to that research question and to all that literature you read. You talk about what the findings mean, both theoretically and practically. You address any limitations in your study, and any potential biases.
So it was like highlighting the good stuff, but also being honest about the limits. And then the conclusion, the big finish of our report. How do we rack it all up nicely?
It should be short and sweet. A summary of your main findings and what they mean. You re-emphasize why your research matters and maybe suggest some areas for future research.
Okay, so we've done title page, abstract, intro, literature review, methodology, results, discussion, conclusion. What's left?
Two more important bits. References and appendices. Citing your sources accurately and consistently, that's super important for academic honesty. The references section, it lists everything you use so people can retrace your steps and learn more.
I've definitely spent way too much time fighting with APA formatting for references. Any tips?
Lots of good resources online, and those citation management tools are lifesavers. But the main thing is consistency. Pick a style and stick with it the whole way through.
Consistency is key. Noted. Okay, last but not least, the appendices. What goes in there?
Think of it as the bonus features on a DVD. It's stuff that supports your findings but might be too much detail for the main part of the report. So things like your raw data, the questionnaires you use, transcripts from interviews, that all goes there.
The behind-the-scenes extras. So, we've covered all 10 parts of a research report. We're practically APA masters now. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of crafting that compelling core for your research, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about how to present those findings in a way that's informative and engaging.
Yeah, this is where the research really comes alive. You've got the data, you've analyzed it all. Now it's time to share those insights, let them shine.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in that final stretch of our research journey, and it's time to talk about, I think, one of the most crucial steps, analyzing and presenting your findings. This is where we get to see what all that hard work was for, right?
Absolutely, yeah. You've gathered all this data, you've been, hunched over spreadsheets and charts for who knows how long. Now it's time to figure out, what does it mean? What are the insights, those aha moments? And then, of course, you want to share it all, but in a way that people will actually get and find interesting.
Finding those aha moments, that's the best. But I got to be honest, sometimes that analysis part, it trips me up. I get so focused on, the technical stuff, collecting the data, processing it. I kind of lose sight of the big picture, the so what factor. Any tips for making sure our analysis actually has meaning, that it's insightful?
I think one really important thing is to keep those research questions in mind the whole time. Those questions that they're like your compass, right? They guide your analysis. They help you pull out the most relevant stuff from the data. Yeah. So always be asking yourself, okay, how does this piece of data relate to my question? What kind of patterns are popping up? What could these findings mean in the real world?
Always go back to those questions.
Yeah.
Easy to get lost, especially when you have tons of data. Our sources, they talk about comparing your findings to the existing research, too. Why is that so important for analysis?
Well, when you connect your findings to what's already out there, it just gives your analysis so much more depth. It helps you answer those questions. Like, do my findings line up with what other people have found? Am I contradicting something? Do they open up new paths to explore? It's like having a conversation, with other researchers, even if they're not actually there.
It's like building on what they've done. And now it's our turn to share. And our sources, they're big on this idea of communicating clearly, simply, especially if you're talking to people who aren't scientists or researchers.
Yeah.
How do you strike that balance? Being accurate, but also making it easy for people to understand.
Honestly, I think it comes down to, thinking of it as a story. People love stories. Stories grab you, they stick with you, they help you make sense of things. So when you're presenting your research, ask yourself, how can I make this a story that people will actually want to hear?
So it's not just data, it's a story with data. What are some ways to make that happen?
Well, first off, ditch the jargon. Use plain language like you're talking to a friend. And visuals. Visuals are your best friend. Charts, graphs, pictures, they bring that data to life. Way more interesting than just looking at numbers.
Give that data a makeover. I like that. What about using humor? Or telling personal stories during a presentation? Is that, allowed in research?
I think a little bit of humor can go a long way. Or a story that, relates to the research. It makes it more human. You're not just some, robot scientist. But, of course, you got to be careful. Read the room. Make sure the humor's appropriate. You don't want to, make a joke, and then no one takes your research seriously.
Find that balance. Connect with the audience without losing that credibility. Okay, well, I feel like we've covered a lot today. From those first steps of setting up your research project all the way to analyzing and presenting what you find. Is there anything we haven't touched on that you think is really important for new researchers?
One thing that's often forgotten is to stay curious through the whole process. Research isn't just about finding answers. It's about asking good questions, trying out new ideas, and being okay with being surprised. Don't be afraid of the unknown, question what you think you know, and be open to finding stuff you never expected.
I love that. Stay curious. Embrace the unknown. That's good advice for anything, not just research. Thank you so much for being here, sharing your knowledge with us. It's been really eye-opening for me.
You're welcome. It's been fun.
And to our listener, we hope you're feeling ready to tackle some research of your own. The world is full of questions waiting to be answered, and you can be the one to find those answers. Keep those research questions coming, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.